Hello and welcome to Top Class with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're talking about how to improve the quality of science teaching. My guest today is a renowned physicist and educator who won the Nobel Prize for Physics back in 2001. He is Professor Emeritus of Physics and Education at Stanford University, a winner of the Yidan Prize, which recognises change makers in education, and he founded PhET website, which has free interactive simulations for teaching maths and sciences. Its simulations are available in 121 languages and have been delivered to learners more than 1.5 billion times. Professor Carl Wieman, thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
There's so much we can talk about your career, but to kick things off, what first sparked your interest in physics?
I'm not exactly sure. When I was in school, high school, I was somewhat interested in physics, but I was interested in a lot of other things as well. And what really got me into physics was as a college student, an undergraduate, more or less by accident. Early on, I got the opportunity to work in a research lab as an assistant. And that experience, it just seemed so much more rewarding than taking classes and learning about things, of actually trying to learn about the world and the universe. And that really was what got me solidly into physics from then on.
Were you always good at it? And by good, I mean considerably better than everyone else.
No, as a matter of fact, when I started college or university, my first physics class, I did quite poorly. Many students had better background than I did from high school, so I almost failed my first physics class. But I just kept working and thinking, and after a while discovered I'd gotten better than other people, even though they'd started out way ahead of me.
So what was it about going into that research lab which turned things around for you?
A lot of it was just the difference in the experience, that in classes, it seemed like what you were trying to do or supposed to be doing is producing an answer which the teacher was looking for. And in the research lab, you were really trying to understand the world. So the questions were sort of much more interesting and real, if you like. And I also just found that working in a research lab, just working very hard, paid off in a meaningful way. And so those were kind of the things that really made the difference for me.
Well, going from someone who struggled at physics, but like you just said, to someone who's excelled, you've written about a whole host of subjects. To give some of the titles to people listening: Stopping Atoms with Diode Lasers, The Search for Parity Violation in Atomic Hydrogen, The Production of a Cold Atomic Vapor Using Diode Laser Cooling. Now, do you find at dinner parties, if people ask you, what have you been writing about, that when you tell them there's a lot of blank expressions afterwards when you try to explain?
No, because I've been working on teaching for long enough that when I understand how to talk to people at their own level, to be honest. And so when, I tell them I blasted atoms with lasers and saw what funny things they did. And that's sort of the level at which I can explain it and they can understand. So,
is there anything you're particularly proud of, which you think is most important, which you've worked on while blasting lasers, as you say?
I've done lots of different things. And so, the work on atomic parity violation was a very long, difficult experiment that we got important results from, that lots of people have been working on, and we did much better than everybody else. And so that I felt was an important accomplishment. And then the work that I get the most attention from is what got the Nobel Prize, and that was for doing something called creating Bose-Einstein condensate, which was getting atoms to extremely low temperatures, much colder than people had gotten before, and that they turned into a new form of matter that Einstein had predicted. So that was something people have been trying to achieve for almost a century. And so we managed to do it. It was hard and worthwhile.
What was it like when you found out you'd won the Nobel Prize? Did you jump up and down, shout, scream? How did you react?
Well, it's very gratifying, but to be honest, I was much more excited when we actually first saw this Bose-Einstein condensate than I was when I was awarded the Nobel Prize for it.
I suppose that's what sets you apart from others. You have spent much of your career trying to improve science education and education in general as well. When you look at the state of science teaching today, do you think science is being taught effectively?
No, I think myself and others do research on the teaching and learning where we do experiments, we collect data and so on. And we know that there's much more effective ways to teach science than how it's been done and how it's being done most of the time. And to just give the most basic level, I think the real problem is sort of the whole concept of learning, which is that the way much of the teaching is based on as the concept of learning is that you've got these student brains and they're sort of fixed vessels and you're putting knowledge into them. And what modern research has shown is really a very different picture of learning, which is that you're really developing and changing the brains as a result of good education, which is good students thinking hard about the subject. You actually rewire their brain. And so it's really about developing capabilities through practice rather than filling it up with knowledge. And so I think at the most basic level is people are still just trying to pour knowledge in as opposed to thinking about how they can have students think and develop their brains.
So instead of just listening to a professor give a lecture, students should be given practical tasks, for example. Kids should be able to analyze problems and try to solve them as opposed to being given the answers.
Exactly. I mean, if you think about you need to be exercising the brain to develop it. So it's really much more like a muscle than we used to realize in the past. And so listening to somebody talk about weightlifting doesn't build up muscles very much. And listening to someone talk about science where you're really not thinking about it very much doesn't help you much. And so you really the students need to be given problems, and these need to be carefully designed problems, like carefully designed exercises for teaching music at the right level and challenge, but also the right kind of things to do to have them really explore and develop their way of thinking about these topics. And so that's what's really important is that what's going on in the students' brains.
And this isn't just about science education. Are you talking about all types of lessons?
That's an interesting question because we have much better data on science and engineering education. Personally, I'm quite convinced we know enough from basic research on how people think and how the brain works. I'm quite convinced that this is true for all academic disciplines, but we really just have the data on it, mostly from science. And it's always a little frustrating to me because I'm quite sure that if we could persuade people from the arts or humanities to think about teaching this way, they could also improve, but they're not used to doing experiments.
How would that work in the humanities class? How would teachers do experiments where they don't know what the outcome is going to be themselves, maybe?
Well, first I should say that in many humanities classes, they already do this better than what we do in science. There are some where it's still just the teacher up lecturing and the students listening, but in many humanities classes, they do involve the students much more in thinking and discussions already, so to be fair. But in terms of how you do experiments, I mean, the kind of things we do is we have students taught in two different ways, a standard lecture, and then some of these, what we call active learning, where they're working on activities. And at the end of that time, then we We give them carefully developed tests that sort of probe their level of thinking and particularly their level of being able to apply these ideas into new situations and see how effective they are at problem solving in new contexts as a measure of their real mastery of the subject. So you can do that in any subject, really.
What about pressures on teachers to follow a curriculum to ensure their students pass an exam? Does a lack of teacher autonomy in some schools and a need to follow the curriculum mean that what you're suggesting could be unfeasible or seem unfeasible to some?
Absolutely. And, I work mostly at the university level. And so this is not as serious a problem at the university level because generally university teachers have more freedom than at the school level. The school level, it's a big issue. But even at the university level, we talk about the tyranny of content that people feel, oh, they just got to cover this certain content rather than paying attention to what students actually can and are learning. So it remains a challenge.
So if in most schools or some schools, the conditions are not there for this kind of learning, what needs to happen to change?
Well, so first, I have to say that, you need to change the training and support for the teachers, but it's also true that what we've seen is almost independent of the school and the setting. Teachers can do more of this. There's still enough room for them to adopt a lot of this.
Yeah, you've received numerous awards for teaching excellence. Carl, I have to say, I was looking at your CV before we went on air to record, and you have the longest CV I've ever read in my entire life. It's over 20 pages long. You have 7 honorary degrees, a dozen honorary memberships, fellowships, numerous appointments, awards. So I think you're in a good place to answer the question, what do you believe are the hallmarks of an exceptional educator, and how can we make more exceptional educators?
So first, I'll say that part of my career was devoted to just that question, that one of the things buried in my CV was directed the Science Education Initiative at University of British Columbia. And it was really devoted to making large-scale change. The goal was to change how all the faculty in science teach. And so we set up a program specifically devoted to that, and the university put up a bunch of resources, money to support that, and then we built a program up around giving faculty incentives to make change and support in terms of expertise within their own department on how to teach in these new ways that would work with them. And it was really a demonstration experiment, but it was pretty successful. In many of the departments, we got over 90% of the faculty to make major changes in their teaching, and it's now been 10 years and it still seems to be sustained. So I think what that showed is that really with the right incentives and the right support, essentially every teacher can learn to do this and can do it.
So what incentives and support are missing at the moment, which it means that science education is not as good as you think it should be?
First, in most places, there are no incentives to adopt better teaching methods. That almost no institution, even though we have all this data that if you teach a certain way, this active learning, students will learn better, be more successful than if they're listening to lectures. No institution actually collects the data on what practices their teachers are actually using. And so that's sort of a first step in improving things is you actually look at how people are doing it. And then you start thinking about incentives to do something better. And so, I would say the first step is really to think about how we measure and evaluate teaching quality and make that system better. And then you have to start rewarding people for doing doing things in a way you know are more effective.
What about teachers and professors, some of whom might be listening, who are looking to improve their teaching methods, where should they start?
That's a good question. There are certainly a number of good books written on the subject that you can go and read and give you detailed discussions of both the reason these methods are more effective and also how to implement them. For some people, that's pretty adequate. For others, it is possible to find workshops and training programs that are set up. Sometimes, particularly, it's an increasing number. It's still not large, of the professional organizations, like the Society of Physicists in the United States runs a program where teachers can go to and spend several days learning about these better teaching methods and how to use them.
I want to talk to you about STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because while young women in OECD countries are more likely to get higher grades than young men, this is not translating to higher paying careers on average. People who study STEM subjects can often go into higher paying jobs like the tech industry. Is the gender pay gap partly due to not as many young women opting for STEM disciplines, which means later in life they have fewer options to pursue as well-paying careers?
I mean, you're asking a pretty broad question about the gender gap, but I think it is clear that at least some substantial part of the gender pay gap is the fact that women go into different careers and those careers pay less money. And the cause and effect is a little complicated because there is some evidence that careers that are dominated by women tend to get paid less, even if they'd previously been dominated by men. So, like I say, the cause and effect is complicated, but I think there is no question that, women who go into science and engineering earn better pay than those who go into many other female-dominated fields. And there is the question about why that's the case and how we might get a broader, more diverse workforce in STEM. And, it's an area of a lot of concern. A lot of us are worrying about that, but it's not an easy problem to solve. I think an awful lot of it goes to very basic societal issues and values.
Yeah, why do you think not as many women as men take up STEM subjects?
I mean, I don't want to proclaim I'm an expert in this area. I've certainly looked at it some, but I think an awful lot of it is just these subjects are seen as, let's say, sort of on a broader societal level of kind of less appropriate things for females to be doing. And so I think that's a big part of it, is just how society views the field. But there's also clear evidence that the culture of these disciplines is kind of less female friendly. That, I have a number of women that I worked with and encountered, and there's no question that they run into bad behavior by people in the subject that, if they had kind of less determination, would actually drive them to say, no, I don't want to put up with this. I'll go to some other, work in some other field where I don't have to encounter these kind of unpleasant behaviors against me just because of what sex I am.
When you say unpleasant behavior, what sort of things are happening?
I mean, things people will say, both making, sexually explicit remarks or suggestions, or also just encountering people saying, oh, women aren't smart enough to do this, and you shouldn't be expected to do this because you're just a woman. So things like that.
You've mentioned already that a lot of this is societal factors, but is there anything that policymakers should be doing, schools and universities should be doing to try and prevent that kind of behavior?
Certainly they should be trying to prevent it. And the challenges are how. I mean, a lot of institutions, my own university has a program in which students have to go through sort of training about these things and how to supposedly make them treat their fellow students in a more acceptable manner. But how effective these things are is a big open question, I think.
Understood. I want to talk to you about the Yidan Prize, which you won a few years back. You used the funds to support teachers to do STEM teaching and learning in Africa and Latin America. Tell us more about that.
As you pointed out, I started this PhET program, which has these interactive simulations for teaching science. And so we set up from the Yidan Prize money, we set up what we call the PhET Fellows program. So it was selected teachers who were interested in this and dedicated in Africa, and mostly in Africa, some in Latin America. And they would go through some training on better ways to teach and particularly ways to use these PhET simulations to help students learn better. And then they would work with teachers in their communities so they were sort of, training them as trainers that they would then reach out. And number of those are particularly in Africa, are just very impressive individuals who are very dedicated and very good communicators. And just, it's exciting and invigorating to interact with them and just see how dedicated they are and what they're able to accomplish.
What would you say their accomplishments are?
I mean, their accomplishments are being able to help many teachers be more effective and use these resources. One of the great things about PhET was most everybody has cell phones. Oftentimes they've got cell phones without textbooks. And so, these PhET simulations can provide an educational resource, which is they don't have any other way. And so then having teachers understand how to use this new technology in the most effective way to help students the most is an important step. And so they're doing that and they're reaching many, many teachers. And of course, that means many more students.
Yeah, looking to the future, how do you see technology such as simulations and online learning platforms? How are they going to shape education in the years to come? Is it going to change significantly?
Well, I mean, you didn't ask about artificial intelligence, which is what everybody's talking about, and everybody asks.
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay. So the answer with these other things is I just don't know for sure where it's going to go. I mean, one of the things we did see was during the pandemic that there was a big increase in use of the PhET simulations because students didn't have opportunities for laboratories and teacher interactions. And so that clearly filled in a big educational need there. But just how far this can go and how effective they are, it's unclear. I mean, I think we still see that the teacher is a good teacher is a tremendously important resource. And it's very hard. If you have a bad teacher, there's not much else that's going to make a good educational experience. And if you have a good teacher, they can do an awful lot without much. So I think at some level, we're still a long ways from anything that says that you're going to have a great substitute for having dedicated, well-trained teachers.
As you mentioned AI, I'm going to have to bring it up. So looking to the future, there are supporters of AI who say it's going to revolutionize education. Do you think education will stay largely the same, or is it going to change dramatically beyond the way it looks at the moment?
So I know lots of people are wondering about this. The one thing I will say is, first, I think the hype has greatly exceeded the results so far. I mean, my group has actually been doing research on the use of AI for teaching, and we find, it has some capabilities, but it's really a very long ways from being a good teacher, if you like. We've been able to get moderately encouraging results, but with a whole lot of work and kind of very limited set. And so I think we're a long ways from living up to the hype people are talking about. The other side of this is that if you look at so much technology in education, it ends up benefiting the rich, basically, and really not helping the poor. And probably in education now, the biggest challenge we face is really helping the poor, economically poor students. I mean, the OECD, when I was at the conference in Paris, was talking about how, all their data they've collected for decades now, and consistently the big effect is the wealthy students, wealthy parents, they always do a lot better. They have better educational resources and they're more successful. And there's been very little progress in making that difference. And this is just another technology where if I had to make a prediction, my first prediction would be, well, if it's beneficial, it's going to mostly benefit the rich people who can afford and have access to it. And so that's always going to be a limitation.
Thanks so much, Carl. It's given me the opportunity to plug the OECD website, where if you do want to check out the latest results of 15-year-olds who were tested from across the world, you can check out the latest PISA survey. It combines data from 81 countries and economies, and it has all sorts of information, including on disadvantaged, advantaged students, on parental background, and so on. Professor Carl Wieman from Stanford University and Nobel Prize winner, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
I'll put in one more plug for the OECD results. Is you talked about the differences in gender in science, and those latest OECD results show that females are notably more creative across all these different countries, and yet we're clearly not taking advantage of that and having their contributions to science.
And to keep up the plugs, there's also loads of stuff about AI in education as well on the OECD website. So get Googling on the OECD website. Lots and lots to see. Thanks again, Professor Carl Wieman.
Okay, thank you for having me.
That's it for now. Please tune in for another episode of Top Class soon. All the best.